Hello and welcome back to the Let's Talk About It podcast. This is going to be the third episode, and just like the last time, I'm alone again. But that's okay because I feel like with today's topic, I'm going to need a lot more time to rant about a couple things. So with that being said, today's episode is going to cover the topic of first world problems. Now, living in London all my life, I've definitely had a few instances of me complaining about things that would be considered first world problems. And if you guys listen to the previous episode and how I spoke about, things like my childhood and growing up later on in life, you kind of understand why I viewed myself to be one of those complainers. Because, like I said in that podcast, I did grow up wanting a lot of things and wanting the best of the best of whatever was out at the time, whether that was shoes or clothes or technology, whatever. But the main reason I kind of wanted to talk about it was because as of recent, I felt like first world problems have been getting increasingly worse for the younger generation. And I don't know whether this sounds like, an old man complaining or anything. I say I'm old, like, I'm a wise man with grey hair, but I'm not 22. I'm just saying, like, I feel as though all people really do nowadays is complain. Whether it's internet or cell service, or even like your phone not having enough battery to last a day, you know? It's all just the most minor and insignificant things that I feel like people in this generation have just been so conditioned and so used to complaining about. And in large part, I can see why it happens. Like, if you're born and raised in a country like the UK, for example, you don't know any other standard of living. So, complaining about those little things are normal to you because you've been brought up in that environment. But at the same time, the people living in first world countries are not from first world backgrounds. Like, there's always a migration story from somewhere. So what I'm trying to wrap my head around is, how does it still exist when the people who could be complaining about these things have experienced worse in their life? But what's more concerning to me is the first generation of first world citizens, because surely if you were raised by parents who lived in much worse conditions than you when you were younger, how could you possibly be in the position to complain now when the people around you can share their experiences of what their life was like, and it can ultimately give you sympathy for them and how they lived and compare it to how you live. But it just hasn't happened that way. And that's not to say that I haven't gone through these experiences as well, and I'm not here to give anybody any kind of lecture or anything, because, like I said, I was one of those kids. But to me, the reason why I wanted to bring this topic up is just because of genuine curiosity on how the whole idea of first world problems are still a prominent thing in today's culture. So when talking about first world problems, you kind of have to think about what makes a place a first world country in the first place. And to me, that is a clear advancement in technology and medicine, and also a higher standard of social and economic power. And whilst that does sound great from an outsider perspective, i.e., a third world perspective, I'm going to try and break down why I feel like living in a first world country has its disadvantages. So the first and most obvious one to me is the basic standard of living. What I mean by this is when you live in somewhere that's considered to be a first world country, technically everything that's there is the best of the best. So when you grow up your whole life seeing people with nice things, nice watches, nice clothes, nice cars, nice phones, you have an expectation of what your life should be like, because naturally you would think that if you're in the same place as them, you deserve the same things as them. And a part of that is obviously due to a high amount of consumerism, which makes sense because if you have one of the biggest markets in the world, why wouldn't you target that specific place? Because that's where consumerism is really going to boom. But where that becomes an issue is it creates this ability to be ungrateful about the things you actually do have. Like, let's take phones for example. As soon as you experience a minor inconvenience with a phone, what do you want to do? You want to change it and swap it out for the latest and greatest products that had been revealed a month ago. And it gets to this point where consumerism becomes so strong that when a new product gets released every single year, you feel like you have to adapt to the times every single year. When in actuality, the original product you owned, in this case a phone, works just fine. But because of how strong consumerism can be, as soon as you find one little thing to nitpick about, you have to adjust to what the first world standard is, which is having the latest and greatest things. So it essentially creates this kind of arrogance towards how you see and value everyday life. And in order for me to kind of go into this topic properly, I need to tell you guys a story. So back in 2019, we went back home to the Philippines. The Philippines is obviously listed as a third world country. And the last time I'd ever been there was 13 years prior to that. So I was basically just a kid the last time I went there. So I didn't really experience the same problems. I don't know if I should say problems, but the same things that I am about to talk to you about now. So the first thing we did after not visiting my home country for 13 years at that time was look for a SIM card. You see where I'm trying to go with this? After almost a decade and a half of not seeing my own family in my home country, the first thing we did was care about our phones. Now, at the time, I didn't really see that as a problem because naturally, if you're in a country that you've never been to, of course, you need a means of communication and all that other stuff to basically survive out there. So that made sense to me in that regard. But where it started to kind of become an issue was when I heard people say that their cell phone data had run out and that they needed to buy more. So to me, it just became very confusing as to why we had even come on the trip in the first place, because we were so endorsed in social media and our phones that we had never really stopped to appreciate the fact that we were in a completely different country. And I'm not going to use my holiday in the Philippines as an example because I've been to a few places in my life, but I haven't actually experienced those places the way other people have. because I can list all the countries that I've been to, but I don't think it would prove much because all we did was stay in resorts. And the first thing I would typically do is ask for the Wi-Fi code. So looking back at my experiences, I can't really say that I've ever experienced all the countries that I've been to because I haven't. I've just explored the most high-end premium version of that country. And I get the fact that people have to document stuff on their phones in order for it to become a cemented memory. But the point that I'm really trying to make is the visceral memory when you experience something without thinking about something like your cell phone is way greater than anything a video or photo could provide. So with that being said, I feel like I've missed out on actually experiencing some of those places that I've been to simply because I worry about the first class standard of living that I've been so accustomed to. And so the point that I'm really trying to make is oftentimes we can be really quick to complain about things that aren't necessarily of importance to somebody in worse conditions than ours. Because for myself, I am going to be honest, I do complain about those things a lot when my phone doesn't work or my laptop doesn't work. I'm very quick to be like, okay, I'm going to break this, I'm going to throw it away. But I sometimes forget how much of a luxury it is to actually own the things that I own. And even when it comes to earning money now, like I said in previous episodes, I do have a job. But what I've realized is sometimes I can be unappreciative of the job that I have by complaining. Complaining about how long the hours are or how hard the workload is, when in actuality people from third world countries would kill to take my place. And so I really had to question whether I was as humble or as down to earth as I really thought I was. Wow, that sounds super arrogant of me to think that I am either of those things, but still, I still had to question my morals because I found myself, whenever things got too intensive, complaining about my day. And that's not what somebody who is super appreciative of the life they have would do. And one of the things that came to my mind when brainstorming this idea for the podcast was the fact that my regular job, which is non-salary and £9.50 an hour, I am considered as somewhat of a rich person back in my home country. And the reason for that is because of how bad the currency differentiation is between UK pounds and Filipino pesos. And that's obviously the case with a lot of other third world countries, but I didn't really realize it until I started working. So now, knowing what I know, I understand why people from third world countries migrate to first world countries working minimum wage jobs, because the sheer value of working a minimum wage job is greater than working a decently paying job back home. So now that I've seen what it's like for people in developing countries and the way that they approach their lifestyle, it kind of makes me think that maybe rural living isn't as bad as people say it is, because you aren't consumed by consumerism and you can really take value in the things that actually matter and you can live in the moment essentially. So going to the Philippines really changed my perspective on the true value of things, because during our trip we experienced what we would consider to be rural living, but what is considered to them to be everyday life. Like the things that we had to do, which was in all fairness not the true extent of how hard the struggle is, to me was some of the most intensive things I've ever had to do in my life. Like when we visited one of our families, we had to pump water out of the well just to shower, and it was cold water. So the fact that I was even stupid enough to expect the water to turn warm once it got going was a first world problem in and of itself. Like the other example that comes to mind was 8 people crammed in a room sharing an air conditioning unit that was run by an old generator. And when that generator would break down, we would have to wait till the next day for it to come back up again. Which meant that we had to sleep the night without it. And I was struggling. And that might have been a thing of, climatization and whatever have you, but the family members around me, they were fine because they were so used to that regularly happening. So looking back at it now, our family members probably thought that we were rich, arrogant kids who did nothing but complain about how bad their experience was there. And I'm not even trying to talk bad about the Philippines, but the point I'm trying to make is it surprised me by just how happy people were there despite all the things that were happening, which we would consider to be a really big inconvenience. And you've probably heard this saying before if you know anything about Filipinos and their culture, but we're probably known to be one of the most cheerful people in the world for some reason. But if you go to the Philippines, outside of Manila, most people would say that there isn't really anything to be cheerful about. Like, yeah, they do have tourist attractions and islands and whatever have you, but outside of that is slums essentially. It's third world living. It's cement houses with tin roofs and water dripping through them. Like, the Philippines, as nice of a place as it is still a developing country. But I think the thing that makes a country like that so attractable is how much people talk about how upbeat and lively the local community are, despite them obviously being clearly disadvantaged to tourists visiting that country. So for me, it was just one of those ones where I looked at all of their approaches to life and was just like, these people really don't acknowledge how bad their situation is. Like, they don't wallow in their own sadness kind of thing. So to me, it was like, how can I sit here complaining when I've got everything that I need? Like, I have hot water, I have heating, I have all these things. Like, one of my significant flaws is that I'm a picky eater. Like, I'm sure many people are, but when I was younger, and debatably now as well, I still refuse to eat food which contain things that I don't like. And another thing is the fact that I just refuse to eat cold food. I think that's something that I've always had to deal with and still deal with, but that's just one of the many examples of how selective I am as a person. And again, I'm going to refer to this term a lot, my first class standard of living. But the only difference that has made my approach to those kind of things a little bit more different is the fact that I always think about the people who aren't in the same situation as me and who don't have the luxury of complaining about little things like that. And don't get me wrong, I was always told by my parents not to waste food and always clean up your plate because there's always somebody less fortunate than you, and think about the starving kids and all of that. But it was just my conditioning of living in a first world country that really made me ignore all those messages that were being told to me. But I guess a good thing is that now I am trying to expand my palette a little bit and not be as picky as I used to be. But anyways, that was a little bit of a tangent there. So going back to the topic at hand, the second problem I kind of wanted to address is the immigrant experience. But what do I mean by the immigrant experience? Well, as I just told you, a lot of people migrate to first world countries in order to have a better survival chance and earn a lot more money than they would back home. And a lot of people say that you always want to give, your children a better life than you had growing up. But I also feel like coming to a first world country allows them to experience a life that they never did. And where that causes a problem is both their children and they get consumed into the first class standard of living like I was talking about. So yeah, whilst the intention of giving your children a better life than you had is a good one, it's also one of the things that could come to backfire you because they could be insensitive of how hard it was for you to get to that particular position, if that makes any sense. The example I'm going to give is toys. Like, just looking at the way kids play nowadays is so different to the way it was 5-10 years ago. I sound so old when I'm talking about it, but like, we used to go to neighbors' houses and play in their gardens or like play on the street. You don't really see kids doing that anymore, as far as I'm concerned. Like, I see more kids on iPads and TikTok than I do in the park. So part of me is like, yes, obviously do give them a better life than the one that you had, but not to the point where they become ignorant to their lifestyle. So I think now more than ever, it's really important for especially immigrant parents to teach their kids about how hard it was to actually make it to the position that they are in today, because at least they can appreciate that not everything is going to be silver spoon fed to them. Because I feel like when that doesn't get taught to them, that's when first world problems occur. So I suppose it is a slippery slope when talking about how you want to raise people in a first world environment. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is sometimes growing up in that kind of environment can be a con because you're kind of blinded by the lifestyle you live, that sometimes you forget to be humble and have humility and empathize with people who aren't as fortunate as you. But before I end off this episode, I just wanted to address something really quickly. And that is immigrants idealizing first world countries. I know a lot of people in my friend group or my family that often dream about coming to the UK or going to a first world country because they think it's this kind of glamorous experience, when in actuality it's really not. And that's the thing I wanted to kind of emphasize, is don't believe everything that you see on mostly mainstream media, because it's not an actual depiction of what a first world country is actually like. Yes, fair enough, the UK is considered to be one of the superpowers of the world, and yes, we do have socio-economic status when compared to other countries. But I think the thing that people often mistake is not everything is Buckingham Palace in the UK. Not everything is tea and biscuits and drinking with your pinky up. And we don't all talk posh. So what I'm trying to say is, although yes, we do live in a first world country, a lot of people in this first world country have third world problems. I would say that outside of central London, if you take a bus 10 minutes in either direction, you will see council flats, run-down buildings, dirty streets, like all that kind of stuff exists in London, but people don't talk about that being London necessarily, even though it is. Like, I would say poverty defines London more than luxury does, in the sense that it's so highlighted by mainstream media that London is this luxurious place with Oxford Street and oh my god, like the Shard and stuff like that, but they never really venture to places like Newham or Tower Hamlets or whatever borough in London you want to talk about. There are slums everywhere you go. Like, poverty exists, homelessness exists, and not everybody that lives in London lives the London-esque experience that is so idealized by a lot of people who have a fake idea of what London can provide for them. And I'm not going to mention the glaring issue that the UK has with the asylum seekers. That's another topic for another day. But oh god, it's just funny how the UK and London in general is just this mecca of the world besides places like America. But yeah, to all those listening who aren't from the UK and dream about coming here, it's not all that it's made out to be. And I can probably bet my money that you will be super disappointed when you arrive here. But this is going to wrap up today's episode of the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. It was a little bit of a weird topic to talk about, but I felt like it was just one of those issues that had been sticking with me for the longest time, and I just couldn't shake it off. So I'm actually kind of glad that I have this platform where I can just openly discuss my thoughts and feelings on certain things. But I know what you guys are probably thinking, and yes, I will try and get a guest for another episode because you can't stand hearing my voice for 30 minutes. So I will try. But I just wanted to say thank you for hanging around with me. If you made it to the end of the episode, you are a real one and I appreciate you. If you enjoyed what I was talking about today, please make sure to like and subscribe. And we can debate this in the comments as well. Was I right? Was I wrong? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know. Oh, and also don't forget to click the little bell icon to be notified about when every new podcast episode gets released. But until we speak again, take care and goodbye.